to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia and our 30th episode, hosted, as always, by the Mad Professor. We are back on campus, after going all round the world and backwards in time, all to bring you everything you need to know if you are going to overcome your misunderstandings about the problems of railways in Australia. After this series, we'll be taking a break and moving on to a new project called the Transit Doctors, and it will have a worldwide outlook. It's exam time, and this is the lesson where we recap what we've been learning. You could go and rehash all the previous episodes, see all the links to them below, but why bother if we're going to do a short summary of them now? So no new content today, just a topic-by-topic discussion of what we've learned so far. We'll go through last year's exam questions and what topics will give you a good answer. In general, given the way this series has been set up, all the questions we are going through are synthesised from all our episodes. If each of our episodes were a station on the London Underground, you could see how they interconnect across multiple lines of thinking, and some of our episodes are going to be those grand interchange stations, like Bank or Hammersmith. So we will keep coming back to those, so you can see how Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia fits together. Let's go back to our questions. Question 1. Australian railways do not have an inevitable destiny, only choices that decision makers must make. Discuss. If we're going to answer this question well, there are plenty of our episodes we can refer to. And we can start with our first episode. This was the luckiest line. One railway that defied the narratives and survived when it probably shouldn't have. This was the Hurstbridge line on the Nillumbik country of the Woiwurrung-Wurundjeri. Everything about this railway was against it, especially when the section beyond Eltham was badly burnt in the 1969 bushfires. The line had all the good reasons not to survive. It had only limited freight, and freight is what usually justifies and pays for most of the railway trackage in Australia. It was in the country, and in 1969, quite a distance into the countryside, and urban railways have a much better chance of survival than country ones. It was heavily curved, and we talk about curvature in later episodes. All in all, 1969 would have been as good a time as any to close it, just as the head of the transport regulatory body, Land, was recommending the closure of numerous other lines, some of them that had better chances than this one, and that he said they should close. For whatever reason, the Balti government decided to repair the fire damage, and by the 1980s, it was upgraded with heavy rails, modern overhead electrification, and eventually concrete sleepers. And in the recent decade, a short section near Wattle Glen has been duplicated. Only in our time are we seeing the true suburbia catch up with it. Answers to this question could lean either way, keep it or close it, but need to address that the 1969 decision could have gone either way, and that it is always up to governments to make such decisions, whether they choose to emphasise how sad it was that the bushfires made them close it, or that the community need was so strong that they had to reopen it. But whatever, it is always a choice. Good answer. We'll also refer to our episode 4, Muddling Through. We looked at how Singapore made the positive choice to invest in rail transport and follow a consistent path of rail development since they started in the early 1980s, with a vision and a plan for a network covering the major urbanised parts of the island. This contrasts with Australia, which copied the British habit of muddling through, where bureaucrats cannot come up with a singular vision and are hostage to major swings in the political system, where elected politicians come up with their own visions and expect the bureaucrats to change their plans. A balanced answer might mention Singapore has the advantage of one-party rule by the Lee family and the People's Action Party, but should also mention that concepts of merit and education are highly valued in Singapore. That episode also looked at Morocco, again an absolute monarchy, but the monarch, Mohammed VI, also values knowledge and expertise, and chose to make high-speed rail a foreign affairs project, a way to strengthen links with France, rather than allow their transport ministry to dominate the thinking on the topic. And if we applied both to Australia, we could see a way out of that sort of muddling through, But again, it is a decision for politicians to make, to sideline certain bureaucrats and advance the interests of others. A further episode you could consider is episode 7, Where the Wildflowers Grow, where we looked at how the whole Perth rail system under Charlie Court was in danger of total closure. But after a nadir in 1979, it bloomed like a wildflower after the heavy rain. The system has gone from 2 surviving lines out to 7 lines, and some of those lines in turn have had extensions, like the ones to Yanchep and Byford. This was led by decision makers at the political level, people like Brian Burke, Jeff Gallop and Mark McGowan, and their respective ministers, and they were supported by an educated and passionate bureaucracy who almost reached Singapore levels of rationality. You can see from this episode how the major outcome of a rail system, either dying or flourishing, pivots on a single point of decision. And of course, this costs money. They made much money from a mining boom. However, this boom was just as visible in the 1970s as it is now. In episode 3, Accidental Death of a Railway, we examined how a similar line to the Hurstbridge line, albeit not electrified, was deliberately defunded and closed in the 1970s. This was the Healesville line, also on the lands of the Wurundjeri, and it was losing what we can agree was only a small amount of money at the time, much less than some lines today are losing. And finally, you might choose to look at our episode Back on Track. This episode covered how passenger railways in Australia have always favoured the large city networks since around the 1970s, and the small local services have all closed. But like in episode 1, the exceptions to this, such as the one from Maitland to Dungog in Gurringi country, or the Judgewarong territory and its line from Ballarat to Maryborough, tell us that it is just a matter of government choice whether to keep these services or not. The episode went into several levels of service that we could provide, all likely to be as affordable to government as the Dungog or Maryborough services, and for fairness reasons, we should have such services everywhere we can physically deliver them. That episode suggested on every line in Australia for up to 90 minutes from a provincial city of 50,000 or more, at a level of 3 trains a day, and this could mean places like Ingham to Townsville, or Nambucca Heads to Coffs Harbour. Maybe you can suggest other places you are familiar with, but the key point is fairness, and if the government is prepared to fund some services, then fairness would suggest a whole lot more. Question 2. False narratives are a cheap substitute for actually doing something about the railway's problems. Most of what we've looked at in this series is the false narratives, and we sort of started doing this in episode 2, where we built on the episode 1 narrative that was based only on one railway to move across to looking at all of them. Having control of the public narrative is the best way for powerful people to get away with continuing to do what they have already been doing, and that is misallocating public resources and not having to be accountable for doing so. The worst thing is they co-opt others into their narratives. We might think of situations where official lies and propaganda in many other places. This could be wartime propaganda to mislead an enemy or reinforce popular support for the war at home, whether it is politicians wanting to be elected. But in the case of railways, it is an enduring pattern of failure, a rail system that was clumsily built and overbuilt in the 19th century and struggled to adjust to a new role, competing with road and air transport in the 20th century. And if your failure is enduring, as our rail managers' efforts were, you then spend more time thinking how to spin the narrative, rather than just going and fixing the problem. In episode 5, we looked at the spurious notions of population and density. These have both gone a long way to letting the guilty off the hook for their failures to stop lines closing and preventing investment in new ones. We looked right down the list of Australian cities. First through the top 5 capitals, to the next 5, which are all the major growth centres outside the capitals. then some larger, long-standing provincial cities in the next 10, and even these, if they were in Europe or Asia, might have their own local rail services, potentially street railways or tramways, but possibly much larger ones. We travelled to Hong Kong and showed just how nonsensical the idea of density is. That city is one of the most crowded on earth, but is also at least 50% by area national park or farming land within the boundaries. We could reframe the density measure by including or excluding those parks and farms from the calculation, and bingo, you now have an alleged measure of density that could be wrong by a factor of 2 without actually changing anything. We saw the political boundaries and geographers' classifications are far too unspecific to have any meaningful application to decisions about railways, and further, when they are used in consultants' reports or feasibility studies, they are invariably being manipulated for the benefit of the sponsor of this work, to find either that there are too many or too few people for that line. We saw in Melbourne the density might in fact be a proxy for measuring aspects of social class. A small house in the inner suburbs might have exactly half as many people in it as a house exactly twice its size in the outer suburbs, as the late Paul Mies, the academic, was fond to point out, and if that is true, the calculated density for the inner suburban house and the outer suburban one would be exactly the same. And we travelled to Sweden in that episode to see the Botniabana, a high-speed line built out into the subarctic wilderness to the relatively small city of Luleå, capturing at most around 100,000 people. Sweden has not concerned itself with the sparseness of population, and in Sweden, just like in New South Wales, which has about the same area as Sweden, it is hard to draw a rational map that calculates the density that you're really interested in. A plausible high-speed network just covering the state of New South Wales might capture 95% of the population in just 5% of the state's area. Another false narrative we tackled was our episode 8. We saw how a cute little story about a cartoon rabbit framed for the murder of his human wife led on to a story about the rapacious motoring lobby in Los Angeles who destroyed that city's interurban and street railways, and how this story, in various formats, has bled out into the wider world and even here in Australia. People believe it as implicitly true, not realising they are letting those rail bureaucrats off the hook again. Road competition is always challenging for rail and has often been unfair, with different standards of engineering, taxation and financing making it harder for the rail operator. But we don't need to imagine the road lobby caused this problem, and if you asked an American back in Roger Rabbit's time, say 1950, who was the bad guy, he would have said the monopolistic rail operators. They were the ones squeezing the little guy who was just trying to ship some goods, or stopping him using his own truck, and road transport was therefore the saviour. In Australia we had nothing like the USA had. No freeway networks. Heavy regulation of road transport lasted until quite late. Ridiculously expensive aviation that most people couldn't afford to use provided no competition to rail. Our rail operators had behaved as lazy and fat monopolies, not investing in improvements in passenger or freight efficiency, and when it all got too much in the late 1960s, they just let all that traffic slip away to their rivals, with barely a whimper. Much easier to make up stories after the event than have to account for what they did. Another pair of narratives we need to watch for is that there is no money for railways and that none has been spent. In episode 10, we saw that money isn't real. It is a construct of government to make it easier for you to exchange your goods and track your wealth. And while you can only spend the money you have, government is not limited in this way. They could print money out to infinity, but they don't, because that would cause inflation. And the real problem, if we want to think of it that way, is not the money, but the lack of productive capacity. The actual labour, materials and expertise that increases that capacity. And so long as rail investment is targeted at those things that expand capacity, it doesn't cause inflation. And in episode 18, we saw that far from a lack of money for rail investment, rail enthusiasts have been lying to you. In fact, We have been swimming in rail money, not just the current spending on salaries and expenses, but capital investment too. The best part of $1 trillion since the early 2010s has either been spent, or is being spent right now, or is seriously proposed to be spent. A good answer will list some of those major projects, like Sydney Metro, Cross River Rail, Metronet, or Melbourne's suburban rail loop, and also point out that we could have easily made that figure larger if we went further back in time to the year 2000 and included projects like the Mandurah line, though in that case we would need to add a factor for inflation. Governments have recently announced a slowdown in that spending, though once this austerity cycle is through, we may see yet more spending, but the idea that there is no money is completely false. And this links to our episode 11 about high-speed rail. The narrative is that Australia couldn't have high-speed rail, which ignores how close we in fact were to getting it, and what some of the institutional barriers are. We've already looked at what Morocco did, but episode 11 looked at radically shifting away from what was proposed before, and looked at those barriers for what they were. By sticking to publicly owned land, we avoided fights with NIMBYs and environmentalists. By rating the existing rail system as worthless, we were able to have it ripped up, and the best bits reused for high-speed rail on completely new track. And by thinking very creatively, like envisaging the surface of Lake Hume and Lake George as just more flat land for a straight high-speed railway that could take them up to 200 kilometres of their 700 kilometre journey, we got that fast alignment we needed. We also tunnelled right under the snowy mountains, like we did in the 1940s and are doing now. And we even closed Melbourne's Upfield line and rebuilt it as an underground metro, in tandem with the new high-speed railway. Why the bureaucracy won't do these things on their own, but have to be led around by others, goes to why they need these narratives, to maintain the look that they are in control when they are clearly not. Question 3. The worst break of gauge problem on Australian railways is the one inside the bureaucrats' heads. Discuss. We looked at the gauge issue in several of our episodes. The main theme in all of them is that while having breaks of gauge is not particularly helpful, using them as an excuse is just another false narrative from the bureaucrats, and one that has been spun out by the enthusiasts. The narrative plays out as claims are made that gauge changing has held us back, but also people have silly ideas about the gauges actually used. In our episode Off the Gauge, we looked at gauge in several ways. We travelled to Spain to see gauge as a technical problem that can be solved by gauge-changing wheel sets. This allowed a hybrid of the unique Iberian gauge and the worldwide standard to be operated as a single network for medium and high-speed trains across Spain and linking Spain to France and the rest of Europe. We went to Switzerland to see that they had deliberately used narrower gauges in their mountainous network to connect with the worldwide standard gauge that ran along the valley floors. And the key to making that work was the legendary Swiss efficiency, making their trains connect punctually like a Swiss watch. We saw that in Austria until recently, standard gauge wagons were hauled on top of skinny gauge wagons to reach their destination. Yet Australia made few, if any, attempts to use technical solutions, whether gauge changing equipment or carrying the wagons Austrian style. And we certainly made no attempts at Swiss style efficiency. We also went back in time to see the American Civil War, where the United States War Department and its Assistant Secretary, Charles Dana, was busy organising for the numerous southern railroads, the ones that had been built to odd gauges, to be converted at their expense to the worldwide standard. Yet Australia never managed to use wartime exigency as a reason to do the same. After the war, the extensive narrow gauge networks were built by private companies, but were later converted to standard gauge as a commercial reality, providing more transcontinental capacity through states like Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Nevada. But a couple of charming lines like the ones to Silverton and Durango, were not converted and survived until the 1960s and have been preserved to this day. And in our episode Turning Japanese, we saw that Japan has always been a multi-gauge network, with the dominant operator JR using mainly the Cape gauge, but many private railways using the worldwide standard. This difference was exacerbated through the decision in the 1960s to build high speed on the worldwide standard gauge, but Japan has managed the consequences through efficient connection at junction stations and also through a limited amount of gauge conversion, such as that between Fukushima and Yamagata, and Morioka and Akita. In episode 24, we looked at the skinniest of the Australian rail gauges, our sugar networks, and noted that on rails barely 2 feet apart, the sugar companies are running massive locomotives, such as the converted former New South Wales 73 class diesel hydraulics, weighing in at more than 30 tonnes and hauling many hundreds of tonnes of cut cane over networks that run for many hundreds of kilometres. If such small trains can haul so much, then there was never any excuse for any of our main rail networks to not be working harder and smoother than they did. And we saw that if Australia had to choose a single rail gauge, maybe the narrower one, the Cape gauge, would have been enough. It delivered semi-trailers on flat cars in the WA and South Australian outback. It also delivered our fastest rail speeds on the Queensland North Coast. And for a while, it was delivering some of the heaviest and longest trains in the world in the Bowen Basin coal haul. And today, in Tasmania, as we saw in episode 15, it also delivers a small and efficient network in very difficult circumstances, with winding track, short trains and short hauls. And the narrative the bureaucrats used was that the break of gauge locations, like Albury or Wallangarra, were a problem for the Australian railways, but they neglect to point out Serviceton on the border between Victoria and South Australia, which was also a nightmare of surplus equipment and labour and overinvestment, and was subject to delays, even though the railway on both sides was the same gauge. So a good answer to our question would be to point out that the Australian bureaucrats had any number of good examples and good opportunities to overcome the gauge challenge, but were slow to muddle through to where we are now. And you could even point out that some of the gauge conversions may have made things worse, whether it is the line through Cressy in the Gulligen country, the closure of lines north of Peterborough in South Australia's Ngudgery land. And it wasn't the physical problems of gauge, but the mental problems within the heads of bureaucrats. Question 4. Politicians, bureaucrats and activists want to battle over the names of railways. Should we care? Discuss. Our main episode for this topic will be episode 6, What's in a Name? We took a trip back 2,500 years, first to ancient China in the Zhou dynasty, where Confucius and his disciple Tzu and the Tao master Lao Tzu were all around. Tzu asked Confucius what he was going to do when he was appointed the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Wei, and he answered he would change the names of things to reflect what they really were, and after a fairly convoluted explanation, because that is what is required for the administrative state to function. Lao Tzu was very sceptical though, believing that this pursuit of names is just an attempt to grab at the purest essence of the thing, which he believed was an abstraction, not anything real or useful. And we took a side trip to see Plato, also pondering perfection, his ideals that he called eidos, or the plural ideia, the origin of our words, idea and ideal. Plato's universe all contained perfect abstractions, while the real universe was full of imperfect things that would never quite match those abstractions. And we see this dilemma at work in the discussion of rail transport. The most obvious of these is the street railway, which goes by the names of tram, streetcar, trolley, and of course the neologism of light rail, which seems to be a contraction of light railway, though as we saw in the episode, these vehicles may not be especially light, and on our so-called heavy railways we may also see similarly light vehicles. In our episode 27, Light and Easy, we looked at how these lighter railways, with some street running, have become an option for cities as large as the Gold Coast, and as small as Bunbury or Bendigo. And this isn't fantasy. The WA government actually did a study on Bunbury and Rockingham light rail lines, and Bendigo even had a trial commuter service a few years ago. And as we discussed in episode 24, Sugar, we can't both describe the sugar railways and the vehicles on Melbourne streets as trams. The incompetent Kane government, whose broader handiwork we saw in episode 17, Short Memory, tried to make use of this naming thing by trying to superficially dress up a railway as a different type of railway. Kane had an industrial problem, which was the number and the cost of the railway workers who worked on the railways to St Kilda and Port Melbourne in the Bunurong country. It had vast millions spent on it to give it a slightly different gauge and voltage in order to fool the gods of industrial relations into thinking this light railway didn't need as many staff, nor staff that were as highly paid. And as much as Plato didn't think gods could be fooled, Kane thought that spending all this money on cosplay was better than just changing those industrial rules. And I doubt Kane himself had much of a view, nor did his minister, Snappy Tom Roper, but this scheme would have been cooked up by the bureaucracy. But at the end of all this, blind Freddy can see that these lines are still railways and the vehicles on them are still trains. Calling them trams changes nothing of their essence, and if Confucius had become Prime Minister of Victoria, he would be duty-bound to change the names back. Another of the silly names is this word metro. We saw the Brisbane government plumbing the depths of silliness, building some long buses and calling them metro. Metro doesn't really describe any actual train, but if it does describe anything at all, it is a service model, a train system dedicated to mass rapid transit, ideally largely underground or elevated, so that nothing gets in the way of high frequency and high capacity. Why are Brisbane so keen to appropriate this name when it clearly isn't a rapid transit railway? A good answer to this question might choose to speculate on it. In Sydney, the new rail system has also taken the name Metro, which seems fitting as it is mass transit system. However, this has enraged many enthusiasts and advocates. Some of them deliberately misnamed the system light rail when it couldn't be further from it. This is a thinly disguised ploy to discredit the system in favour of the existing New South Wales Government railways, now called Sydney Trains. Possibly because these enthusiasts and advocates can see the New South Wales Government railway has been discredited, and the new Metro name and organisation was the government's opportunity to turn over a new leaf. This name Metro has become so valuable, the current Victorian Premier, and also the member for the seat of Bendigo, has promoted heavy rail transport within the Greater Bendigo area under the name Bendigo Metro, a farce to be sure, but she has overseen the reconstruction of 4 Bendigo railway stations and the upgrade of 2 others. She's clearly been watching our episode 12 back on track. There are other names you could also talk about. For example, the word suburb, which means something very different in Australia from what it can mean in every other English-speaking country. We saw in episode 16 with Friends Like These, Australians are inclined to regard every part of a metropolitan area or a large city, other than its central business district, as a suburb. This groups inner urban and outer urban settlements together, and even some settlements that are not contiguous with the main settlement, into the word suburb, and ignores more useful questions such as distance, economic role, and how communities identify. Australian settlements, like Geelong or Parramatta, have historically had a weak identity. That means they can be easily subsumed into the names of nearby Sydney or Melbourne, whereas if we were in Europe and a place like Wiesbaden, that city would have been historically and politically very distinct from the larger city of Frankfurt, to which it is joined. Even in the USA, people talk about San Francisco Bay rather than the city of San Francisco, to avoid roping in the likes of Oakland, San Jose, and several other distinct cities that are now part of one urban area. High-speed rail, we saw in episode 11, is another example. though you're more likely to see this outside Australia. Some Australians have a fantasy that 160 kilometres an hour, which is the effective maximum speed of trains in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and WA, is somehow to be regarded as high speed, when it isn't even close. That said, Americans are also inclined to misuse the term to cover for the regrettable lack of genuine high-speed trains in their country. The lesson for us is the contest over names that we see in the real world, but remembering that names being changed does not change our underlying reality. Question 5. It is said the first casualty of war is truth, but how true are war narratives in explaining what is wrong with our railways? War is a touchy topic, but we are all adults here, so let's dive in. Your mad professor's family had some contact with the war in Darwin, and your own history might yield interesting stories, and possibly some sad ones. We can start with our episode 25, When the War is Over, which looked at how the war and the prior Great Depression affected our railways. The common narrative, but the wrong one, is that the Second World War was bad for Australian railways, when in fact it wasn't. It was just some of the usual suspects in the bureaucracy making up excuses. There was a labour shortage as men were called up, but you could put much of that down to the overmanning and the inefficiency that required so many services to be run, so much maintenance to be done. You can use the silly example of the Victorian locomotive that was built as a once-off. This false narrative was that the locomotive was too heavy and had to be restricted to one line. The conundrum supposedly was that building heavier locomotives would improve wartime efficiency, but without fixing the track, building heavy locomotives would be in vain, and there were no resources to fix the track. Which is all very well until you look across the oceans to Europe or Asia, where the war had been going for some time and had caused far more death and disruption than would ever happen in Australia. The lesson from real wars, and even our experience in Darwin, is that people made do with whatever they could, however they could. Nobody had time for silly narratives. Even the more serious questions of what the war actually signifies for railways has been lost in all our false narratives. War in the USA meant improving the railways, and under the pressure of heavy demand, the transition was made from steam to diesel, which improved efficiency. Aviation and road transport too, both received their turbo boost from major wars. Placing most systems under pressure causes most managers to want to be innovative and try new things. Well, at least, not our bureaucrats. And war produces lots of new technology, not just in rail, but importantly for us, it advances rail technology in leaps and bounds. Immediately after the war, American manufacturers Budd and General Motors were able to put together self-propelled air-conditioned rail cars, like these ones that we looked at in episode 21, using transmissions they designed for their Sherman tanks. Other rail cars, including these very successful ones still being built in Victoria, used power plants pulled out of marine applications and a torque converter that was built by our wartime enemies. Even these rail cars from Wegmann, used successfully by the Commonwealth Railways for many years, were the same ones Hitler used. Recovering from war is what we saw in episode 9, Electric Dreams. The French had a robust system of mainline electrification going into World War II. This was obviously badly damaged by attacks from both sides and from their own resistance, but recovered quickly. And in 10 years they had developed a high voltage AC system and tested it at the then unheard of speed of 300 kilometres an hour. And from this base they later went on to develop Europe's first high-speed trains, the TGV. Japan too, as we saw in episode 26 Turning Japanese, recovered from the horrors of war, including the complete destruction of 2 cities by nuclear weapons and the flattening of Tokyo, Osaka and others by conventional bombing. Yet by the late 1950s they had not only put it all back together and were building the first high-speed railway, the Shinkansen, beating the rest of the world to have consistent operation above 200 kilometres an hour. In the rest of the world, war has either advanced the cause of railways, or at least not hampered it. Only in Britain, which we looked at in episode 19, Dr. Beeching, I presume, where their post-war recovery was feeble and wrong-headed, which flowed through to here, where we didn't even really have a war, and that narrative, that Australian rail was hampered by war, has survived to this day. And 6. Enthusiasts and advocates are part of the problem, but we could make them part of the solution. Discuss. False narratives would not be false without our bureaucrats, but they would not be narratives without the enthusiasts and advocate class. Someone needs to tell these stories once they've been invented, and let them grow in credibility and pervasiveness in the retelling. In the earlier questions we looked at a wide range of false narratives, silly ones like heavy locomotives, or cowardly ones like the evil road lobby monster. But in this question you need to focus on the role of the enthusiasts and the advocates in telling of the narratives. In episode 13, we saw the way official histories become folk histories through hero narratives that the bureaucracy employed, framing those early railway pioneers and commissioners as heroes, men like John Whitten of the New South Wales Government Railways, or later bureaucrats like Bradfield or Clapp, and these people were somehow inspired. This is not to take away from the skills of these men, who did indeed have vision, but we can look at the downside of these same stories. Why did Whitten build so many lines so poorly? Why was Bradfield's scheme never finished? And as we saw in episode 14, Harold Clapp built a fine and very advanced train for its time, the Spirit of Progress, but why build only one when dozens were needed? And you can weave in some of our discussion from episode 25, When the War is Over, to supplement our thinking, as we looked at the Great Depression and argued that it wasn't the excuse the bureaucrats thought it was, as most overseas jurisdictions spent the second half of the 1930s spending up big on new and advanced technology. It was only us. Now, this would be a fine debate for learned historians of administration or politics, but the history writers didn't intend that to happen, so they wanted these hero narratives filtered through the unwitting rail enthusiasts who repeat them wholesale. And add to that the credulity of folk history, the likes of Patsy Adams Smith and her ilk, writing about the dull, ordinary lives of the workforce, which she romanticised. Her tale of railways was basically the giant social club for rail workers, which if you read any railway Facebook page these days, you can see that being perpetuated. Maybe those times were great for individual rail workers or former workers. They remember their fond times with their mates, on the footplate, in the depot or the workshop, or on the station platform. And they remember when there were so many more of them than there are today. But they overlook how they were wasting taxpayers' money while missing opportunities to have built a better railway. And they despise the learned people who do know better about things like railway planning or economics. They also despise the technology that improved the job, like providing automated trains or self-propelled rail cars, such as the ones we saw in episode 21, Self-Motivating. They even despise the comfort and air conditioning we have added to trains to make them competitive with other transport modes. Nostalgia is a great drug, but that's all it is. It has no bearing on the truth of our railways, that they weren't the good old days they imagine. Enthusiasts also like to lie about the political parties and imagine that their favourite party were the heroes when they were going to support that party anyway, and the other party were the monsters when they weren't. We look back on the infamous Jeff Kennett, Victorian Premier, when some of the most horrific things happened in the health and education space, with large numbers of people losing their jobs, and public servants more generally. But while Jeff did close a few significant country passenger services, it is not what these enthusiasts imagine, and in fact, he actually restored one service to Echuca. Not a centimetre of the suburban system shrank. Now maybe these enthusiasts confuse Kennett with Hamer, who we looked at in episode 28, Living in the 70s, and he did close dozens of small passenger services. Of course he was a Liberal Party member too, so maybe that is the source of the confusion. Actually, we can be pretty sure they do not confuse these events. They were more than 15 years apart. New South Wales enthusiasts are inclined to do the same with Nick Greiner, whose track record on rail is very mixed. He started with his booze report, designed to cut out some of the garbage from the state railways, which RAN had yet to remove. But it ended with dreams of Swedish or Danish high-tech rolling stock, a new airport railway under construction, some long-standing projects to electrify to Richmond and south from Wollongong having been completed. What these enthusiasts don't grasp is why some politicians act the way they do. Both Kennett and Greiner, in slightly different contexts, wanted to paint the ALP as unfit to govern, and knowing the links between the rail unions and Labor, took an easy route to doing that. But the real villains, if we need one, were the Treasury departments, especially in Kennett's case. They told him he had no money to spend, but by 1999 this was not true. Those country areas that wanted their trains back voted instead for independence, and those independents sided with Labor, and then Kennett was out. But for a few $1 million to put the trains back, if only Kennett had known. And the 1970s is a good place to look at our episode 20, Twin Peaks, how enthusiasts and advocates fall into the traps, such as imagining that the passenger rail system exists to only serve the white-collar clerical class, the ones who work in CBDs of our 5 largest cities. We saw in that episode that this thinking is distorting the spending priorities so much that we end up with new projects of questionable value, like the Melbourne Metro Tunnel or Cross River Rail. The main problem with these projects is they are radial capacity projects based on the twin peaks of demand to and from the CBDs, rather than spreading the load around through time and space, like the Suburban Rail Loop project in Melbourne will do. But the tragedy of Twin Peaks is one you can skip over if you wish. It can be a bit harrowing, so jump to the time shown if you wish. In the 1970s, the daily 609 commuter train from Mount Victoria to Sydney derailed under a bridge at Granville, causing the bridge to collapse on the train, and then the death of 83 people and 219 injuries. This alone is enough tragedy for most of us, but it generated its own false narratives. The truth is that the 1970s government of Bob Askin and his minister, Milton Morris, who was actually a rail enthusiast, and his permanent head, Philip Shirley, and we'll come back to Shirley, but these men allowed the railways to run down to the point where a derailment like this was inevitable. But the false narrative, propagated by enthusiasts and by the TV docudrama by Liberty Productions, was that the train was speeding. And even that is not the real false narrative. The real narrative is that these trains from the Blue Mountains and the Central Coast had to speed because their precious cargo was marginal seat voters, depending on these trains because they lived out of Sydney and were forced into long commutes. And why do we say forced? Because of planning and transport failures in the Sydney Basin. The failure to implement the Cumberland Plan in the 1950s with its Ebenezer Howard-style Garden City fantasy. The failure to upgrade the railways. These failures were political failures, and they translated, at least according to the narrative, to angry voters and marginal seats that needed to be placated with trains that went too fast for safety. Now this is complete tosh, but you can see how compelling this narrative would be, tinged with a dose of cynicism and a hint of conspiracy theory to it. The truth is, whether the train was a few kilometres an hour over the limit is quite irrelevant, and all trains and all commuters are entitled to safety at all times. But in one sense, a narrative about failed urban planning and failed rail investment does have a ring of truth to it, to this mad professor. Getting into urban planning, our episode 16 looked at the trouble that well-meaning urban planners and urban planning advocates have caused for rail transport. They bought into those lies we saw in episode 5, and how Australia supposedly lacks population and density required for good rail transport, and failed to heed episode 12 about how those small communities outside our cities need rail transport for the same reason as city dwellers do. And these urbanists have been spreading this nonsense around like walking in dog poo. If we were in Japan, we would not be surprised to see an electric urban train running among the lightly settled rice paddies. And even in France, in the 1970s hellhole, a new town called Val de Reuil in rural Normandy, the car is king, yet they still have a good enough, fast electric rail service. We saw that some urbanism is probably a product of sociology, not so much a desire to have good cities, but for inner urban educated people to replicate their preferred lifestyle in the outer suburbs and the country. It causes them to have an unhealthy attachment to so-called light rail we saw in episode 27, and may even be based on what we call vacation urbanism, their memory of that good little tram system they rode when they were on holidays in Amsterdam or Lisbon. And to wind up the talk about where enthusiasts go wrong, let's finish with episode 19, Dr. Beeching, I presume, where we looked at how rail narrative exported from the UK about a grim-reaping bureaucrat who is badly remembered, the Dr. Beeching of legend. Not only did he close railways in Britain, but was not far short of the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. He did in fact oversee our Philip Shirley of Granville fame, who in turn oversaw Alan Ryer, who had worked for Hamer when those country lines were closing, those ones that the enthusiasts were blaming on Kennett. And Ryer in turn oversaw John Hirsch, who is still promoting rail schemes today, ones that apparently he didn't manage to implement for John Cain when he was the CEO of V-Line, as we noted in episode 17. But back to Beeching. What enthusiasts refuse to see is that the man was a cardboard cutout, a pantomime monster, to frighten children like these enthusiasts. Beeching did in fact make mistakes, but neither was he the only one to recommend closures, nor was he the one who implemented them. Like in episode 1, we noted that rail closures are always a political choice and are never inevitable, but if you're going to close lines, you need to make up narratives to justify that, and they need cartoon monsters, whether in the form of Beeching or Kennett. So how can enthusiasts and advocates be part of the solution? In episode 14, we saw the good that has been done in Australian rail. We had an example of an express train, the Spirit of Progress, that definitely was in the vanguard when it was built in the 1930s, but only one was built when we needed dozens. Then we saw the double-deck interurban set, a technical achievement in 1970 when it was first built. Now hundreds of these were built, but we could have had thousands, not just in Sydney's interurban belt, but in the suburbs and regional areas of all our cities, for intercity work and even for long-distance luxury trains. We noted that this tunnel at Marangaroo was really the only barrier to a double-deck cruise train from Sydney to Perth, and had the mainline electrification of the 1950s been completed to Wallerawang, as we saw in episode 9, maybe not even this tunnel would have been a barrier. We also saw in that episode that the freight model in Queensland coal haulage in the 1970s, called Locotrol, also put us in the vanguard of efficiency of rail haulage, and some of the world's longest trains at that time. These are healthy narratives for our enthusiasts to propagate, unlike the other ones. And rather than pushing the idea that these old wooden carriages were good for passengers, like many rail enthusiasts do, they should have pushed for more of these self-propelled rail cars for country services, the ones we saw in episode 21. These rail cars had already become viable for a fast and comfortable journey in the early 1950s, and we could have built hundreds or thousands of those too. And finally, looking back to our last episode, maybe the enthusiast or advocate culture could have spurred more of the US short-line railroad being implemented here in Australia. Rather than railing at someone like Kennett, we needed dozens of community-owned railways seeking a profit, but also able to lobby for grant funding to take over from those bureaucratic monoliths that had run the railways for 180 years. So you can see, there are bad narratives out there, but good narratives that could have replaced them. Australian Railways as a positive, a can-do enterprise in charge of their own destiny. That's the end of our 30th episode, and the last for a while we have a break, and we'll return with a new project. Join us when the first episode of The Transit Doctors is shown. A link will be posted on this channel. Have a good semester break.